Greetings, everybody. Welcome to our first edition of the Future of Death. My name is Michael Hebb, and I'm the founder of Community and Death Over Dinner. And I'm joined by two tremendous humans and dear friends of mine who you're going to meet in just a moment. And I agree, Becca, that Bowie is the best way to start. For those of you that are joining us, please let us know your name, where you're coming in from today, tonight, this morning, wherever it might be. And maybe if you want to share one thing that drove you to this conversation, that attracted you to this conversation. I'll tell you where this conversation came from in my own person and being. It was early in the pandemic, and I had two thoughts late at night. The first one, right after Seattle, the night after Seattle had locked down, which was almost precisely a year ago. I woke up in the middle of the night and I realized that the way that people died, the way that the experience of family would have around a loved one in an ICU or in a hospice or anywhere at home, you name it, would be very, very different for the unforeseeable future, as we were locked down and not able to be near our loved ones, especially when they were in a care setting. So I felt that. I felt very keenly that the way that we gathered for funerals would change for the foreseeable future. That we wouldn't be able to hug each other and gather and share even our rituals that I still think need to be reinvigorated around how we grieve in many cases. But we wouldn't even get those basic um, comforts of the existing rituals. And so the first thing I did was gathered a group of people, and we started what became the COVID paper. And that's covidpaper.org to give people resources around how to respond. What are best practices in this COVID period when it comes to death and dying and grief? The second thought that woke me up in the middle of the night was, this is a rich time. This is a rich time of learning about how to compassionately care for each other. And I realized that another pandemic, the AIDS pandemic, um, was where so many of my mentors and the people that inspired me and the people that have shaped the end of life model of care that we practice were deeply impacted, actually shaped in many ways by the AIDS crisis. They were right in the middle of it, learning how to take care of people when there were so many unknowns, and taking care of people that were really struggling with what was happening to them and to our world at that moment. People like Ira Byock, people like Elizabeth Kubler-Ross and Frank Ostaseski, and so many people were shaped during that time. And I had this very, very clear thought that this is a very rich time over however long it lasts, that we were in this very fertile adaptive valley learning about the future of compassionate care. As we were taking care of people in COVID, all of the frontline workers, the scientists working in labs, from so many different aspects, the future of how we take care of each other was being formed and shaped, and it continues to be as we start to maybe come out of this pandemic or go into whatever is next. And so I thought this is a great time to learn while we're actively learning, and to use it to really understand what the future of compassionate care what care looks like. Also, to talk to scientists and futurists, to talk to ancient practitioners or people that work with ancient practices and rituals, that this would be an extraordinary time to look all the way back, to get very present, and to look forward and start to, make some predictions, have some conversations. And so I reached out to Don Gross and Joon, two people I admire greatly who come at this topic from very different perspectives. And I said, can we start something? Can we spark a conversation together and then go off and have a few other conversations with whoever we're curious about. And then maybe those people will have some conversations, and we're going to track the whole thing. And so that's what you're taking part in tonight, is the first version of this, the first episode of The Future of Death. And I'm going to ask everyone who is listening, when we pose each other, we're going to ask questions to each other. And I'm also going to ask that question when I'm asking it to Joon or Don, or they're asking me a question. It's an open invitation to use chat and to answer the question yourself, because we do want to hear from you. And we'll interact with it a little bit, but it's mostly there so that we can look at these responses afterwards, and we can really understand what the community was feeling and seeing and hearing and talking about. So to begin, I'm going to turn it to my dear friend Don Gross, who is a palliative care physician, a mentor to many, a guide for so many, and such a resource for the families that she works with. And we're going to start by going back to an old ritual of honoring an ancestor, somebody who's no longer with us, who had a positive, powerful impact on our life, or someone who's no longer breathing on this plane, let's say. I'm sure that many of these people are still with us. So, Don, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Michael. The first person who is very much still present with me, though not breathing in this plane, as you phrased it, is my father, Roy Howard. He is the reason I say that I am a hospice and palliative care physician now. He has been my first guide and teacher, even though that was not his profession by any stretch. But he has definitely showed me the way and continues to do so always. So I bring my father into our conversation today.
Beautiful. And Dr. Joon Yun, who wears so many hats. When I think of him, I just smile because of his huge heart, but also this incredibly nimble mind that I just want to follow wherever it goes. But Joon was an anesthesiologist, turned hedge fund manager, turned world changer, has started many prizes, including the Longevity Prize, and had a huge impact on how we think and what we do, and will continue to. Joon. Oh, yeah, you might be muted.
Thank you for having me, Michael. Dawn, good to see you again. And hello, everybody. And I know I do put some people to sleep, but that said, I'm a radiologist, was a radiologist, not an anesthesiologist. And I've been in the investment business now for 23 years in the healthcare space, running a hedge fund. In terms of who I would like to honor to kick off our session, my grandfather. Our family has been together since 892, so I'm technically a 38th generation farmer out of this village. And I was born into a village that was, felt very much like home, and is a traditional Korean farming family. My grandfather, what I noticed about him, he was never a teacher. He just lived, and I observed him. And I'll mention one of the stories later. But the reason I want to honor him at the top of the hour here is because he, in the Korean tradition, you're supposed to bow deeper to your elder. Um, and he did the opposite. He was the village head, but he always bowed deeper to whoever was walking by. So he'd be the first one up in the morning, sweeping the streets, and a 3-year-old would walk by, a toddler, and he would literally stop his sweeping and he would bow deeply and hold his bow until the child passed. So, I've reprocessed that many times over the years, but what I took away from it was the idea that respect is something you give and not something that you got. And I think the world would be a little bit of a better place if we focus on respect we granted to others rather than focusing on earning the respect of others.
Beautiful. Um, I'll go ahead and share and honor an ancestor, and that person is going to be David Bowie. In fact, we'll give a little context to Space Oddity. I remember exactly where I was when I found out that David Bowie had died. I was sitting in a cafe in West Seattle, and sound and vision was playing in this cafe. Not for a reason it was playing. And I looked on my Facebook feed, and it said, somewhere in the universe, the brightest star has gone out. And that's all it said. It was my friend David Yama who had posted that. And the combination of that and the song, and I knew that Bowie had died. And I started crying kind of uncontrollably. Um, and I was incredulous too. I was like, why am I crying? Because I'm not the type that has ever cried about losing someone that I don't know, and I didn't know David Bowie. But what I realized was that he had done so much for me and for so many people with, one of the things that's most important to me, and that's giving people permission, taking away shame, giving people the opportunity to shine their light, to be who they are. And he gave so much permission his whole life, at great risk, and was really rewarded for it as a result, and was such an inspiration. So that's who this goes out to for me tonight. And please share in the chat if you haven't started already. So we're gonna start, and now this is just popcorn style to whoever wants to respond. And we came up with some of these questions together. We said, what are the questions we'd like to ask each other, ask ourselves, and then ask other people? And since we're talking about the future of death, we figured let's ground it in our personal lives first and foremost, and let's think about our personal death, and specifically about longevity, which would be how far our personal death is off for ourselves and how we think about it and how that turns into actions. And the question is, what do each of us do personally um, to increase our lifespan? What are we doing around longevity? Joon is known for um, the longevity prize about um, you know this idea of could we cure death, which we'll talk about um, in the future. Is he, are you more of like the Ray Kurzweil, take 3,000 different pills a day, extend your life? Or what are we doing? And Dawn is around end of life all of the time. How does that transform or find itself in our actual lives? So I'll let one of you take it away.
I see that gesture. I'm going to assume you're asking me, Joon, to take it away. So I do perfunctory things, I think I would call it, as far as trying to do intelligent ways to make sure the life that I have is as functional as it can be for however long that is. So I wouldn't say I'm trying to do things like take pills, as you're saying, millions of vitamins or what have you. Not that I'm opposed for other people, whatever you believe in the science supports, you go. But for me, it's not so much I want to live to a certain age as much as I want to be able to do the things that matter to me. And mostly what inspires that are the things that matter to my family, my children. So a while ago, I had some significant health setbacks and noticed that I was fatigued just doing very little physical activity. And yet my kids very much wanted to go to Disneyland. And that was this sort of, I need to have enough energy like that so that whatever my kids want to do, the answer is always yes. It's not, I'm too tired or I hurt or something like this. The answer needs to be yes. And so whatever's in the way right now or potentially in the future, I want to do what I can now to minimize that from showing up. So for example, this week we're about to go to Joshua Tree and go rock climbing. I'll tell you, a couple of years ago, Dawn, when you turn 50, will you take on a new sport like rock climbing? The answer to that would be absolutely not. And most people, I'm sure insurance companies would back this up. I think in Seattle, in fact, at the University of Washington, they don't allow healthcare insurance for people who rock climb. Like the university won't back it because it's too high risk, right? So this is an activity that is not about prolonging my life. And it is an activity that is all about doing the things that bring my family joy. So I want to be able to live that kind of life forever long.
Yeah.
All right, Joon or Michael, you're up.
Thanks, Dawn. And Dawn and I are actually on the same team here, even though, on the surface, it might look like we're doing different work. But, uh, you know, my work is on functional longevity, meaning, we want people to be able to age well, do it healthily. It's if you're actually highly functional and healthy, you're probably are going to live longer. But it's really focused on quality. So in a way, we're both palliative. I mean, she's doing the actual frontline work. Right now, aging in America is not anywhere near where it can be. And I think the Americans especially have a kind of the same dissociated response to aging as they do to death. They kind of put it over there, and people tend to age out of sight. When we're young, our parents tend to be not in our homes like in most traditions, but they're elsewhere. We visit them maybe once or twice a year. They're in hospices, hospitals, and as a practitioner, you receive them, so you see just how devastating aging can be functionally, psychologically, spiritually. We can all do better both in our own aging and to support each other. Um, I personally don't take pills, and I laud people that do, and whatever they do to make their lives more functionally healthy. Um, the thing I do focus on is resilience. I think about aging as the loss of bioresilience. Our ability to contend with changes declines, especially after 40. I mean, once I turned 40, I lost my capacity to deal with temperature change, altitude change, light change. I know, and I can't see at night the way I used to. It's too bright outside. Um, just any kind of change. And I think that's really it goes down all the way down to the cellular and the molecular level. We no longer have the fidelity of response to be able to deal with what's put in front of us. And ironically, the way to combat that is to expose yourself to more of it. Small doses of stress, eustress is what we would call it, opposite of distress, can build out those buffers. We can be more resilient. It'll prepare us for future challenges, including our biologic aging. So that's the way I think about it. So in other words, I don't eat a specific diet. I actually continually rotate my diet. For instance, I hear that Doritos are not good for you, but I know it tastes good. I don't want to lose my ability to tolerate Doritos, so I eat at least one bag of Dorito a month. Whereas I think if you're like gluten-free all the time, what I've heard from people that do it assiduously, you actually lose the ability to tolerate gluten. So the less we use a muscle, the more we lose it. So why not actually flex everything like your muscle, and spend more time in the sun, spend more time in altitude, do things that challenge you as your way to maintain this robustness. So functional longevity is where I put my scientific energy, it's where I put my intellectual energy, and probably my personal energy as well.
There are 92 people ordering Uber Eats bag of Doritos right now because they just needed permission from Junyan. There are also some very amazing specific elements to June's diet that maybe we'll get into today or some other time that I think are phenomenal. But for me personally, um, I, I know that both fear, living in a state of fear, living in a state of repression, living in a state of suppressing parts of myself or emotions are actually part and parcel and very connected to the onset of disease, and a variety of different diseases. Um, and that's to me even more clear than any specific dietary, other than generally eating a Mediterranean diet. So what I actively do around longevity is, one, work on my fear of death. a confrontation with death, so I'm not in anxiety around it. I work on aspects of surrendering. I think that surrendering to what is larger than us is one of the great ways of reducing our baseline anxiety and our fear. Breath is so important. I think about how I'm breathing. I mean, that is going to be with us forever. And if I'm breathing from my belly, if I'm breathing through my nose, and actively being aware of my breath, and expressing my emotions, making sure that things are cleaned up amongst the people that are in my lives. And if I don't want to clean them up, I create a boundary. I've learned that if you have a confrontation with somebody, um, and you decide to clean it up, you're going to get closer to that person. So you have to decide whether you're going to get closer or not, or create a boundary. So that's one of the elements of longevity. I would also say that um, my sister, Joon, who you've met, I believe, who works at Tufts Nutrition, once told me that there is a direct correlation between those that eat grains and eat fruit and eat and live a very long life. And that I took as an invitation not to eat Doritos, but to continue to eat bread, and and local grain and high quality grain as a central part, which is my favorite thing to eat. um, and I know that I may not be as paleo fit as some of my friends, as a result, but I think that this, bread friendly body will go a lot longer as a result. So that's, that's my thing. Oh, and the one other thing, there's a direct relationship between longevity and the depth, and quality of the connections in our life. I have extraordinary humans in my life, and I maintain those connections. Not as well this year. I haven't made heroic efforts, but so that's longevity. Let's talk about the big capital D word. And the question that we wanted to consider next was, what has changed about our own perspective? What has changed about your own perspective about death while working in this field? Um, and by, both of us, or all three of us, have work in very different parts of the end of life space. But what has changed about our perspective, and what has changed? A second part to that question is what has changed specifically in the past 12 months, if anything, as an addendum.
Dr. Gross?
A lot has changed. Thank you, Dr. Yoon. A lot has changed for me over my professional and personal lenses. As a young person, and to this day, I am personally not a fan of death. So this is not something I covet or look forward to. And many people assume, since I work with people who are at the end of life, that I have some sort of comfort or perhaps affinity even for death, and I don't. What I have come to appreciate about death, and the privilege of being with people who are experiencing the end of life, is a profound presence, a profound capacity to be fully present to life. And so, if death teaches me anything, it teaches me that we have that capacity our entire life. And for whatever reason, as humans, we have a tendency to allow other things to distract us, perhaps from what matters most. And when we are present to the finite nature of life, then suddenly we give ourselves permission to focus only on the things that matter most to us. And whether that is tidying up relationships, whether that is indulging in Doritos, or surrounding ourselves with family, or traveling and seeing places that have remained undiscovered to us, or sitting in our own garden. Those are the things that are potentially available to us at all times if we choose to focus on that. And I think in the last 12 months, that has only become more magnified when it seems that our relationship to recognizing how we die matters has become constrained because of what COVID has required us as a civilization to confine ourselves to if we're trying not to die. And therefore, even being with people who are dying, we have needed to get creative and resigned in some cases as to what is and is not possible. So I think recognizing our role in being up close and personal with death is an opportunity. It, as I said, for me, it doesn't make it any more inviting. I'm not excited to die. I really love life. And death teaches me how much more I love life. So that's what I have to share.
So beautifully said. Um, when I was in the village, we would visit during the summertime. When I think the first time I became acutely aware of death was, in the village. Uh, so there's a hill in the back of the village, actually more the center back of the village, and my grandfather would ask me to come help tend to and clean up the tombstones and the monuments that were set up on the hill. And it was always hot because it was summertime. It was dusty and also a little bit spooky, like essentially being in a cemetery. And it was not an organized cemetery; they'd just been buried over the centuries. And to see rows of ancestors in one vista, I mean, it just telescoped the centuries in my mind, like just how fast life is and how short life is. And I think it also, I would ask my grandfather, why are you making me do this? Why do I have to do this? It's too hot, right? And it's kind of scary. And he would just tell me, just where's your spot going to be? I mean, I'm like I'm like 10 years old, right? And it had the effect. Again, he wasn't trying to impart a lesson, but what I got out of it years later, and I'm still processing, is that life is short. Live a life of honor, and that's about it, right? And that's extremely liberating in a way. You don't overthink it. When I was in medical school, I remember during the pathology rotation, you kind of do like a week or 2 weeks on autopsy. And so you're holding the beeper on a Friday. And then someone's going to die that weekend and you're going to, be doing an autopsy, right? So it was like the weirdest thing to be holding a beeper on a Friday, knowing that as I'm receiving the beeper, somebody who's going to be dead doesn't know they're going to be dead. Like I'm just looking at this thing. I mean, it might be an old person who's really at the end of their life, or it might be a young person who's about to have a fateful event, like in a car accident, right? But just knowing that from the perspective of somebody in the autopsy room, someone's going to die. And so it also made me just acutely aware of the things that, Dawn was saying about life and the exquisite nature of it, right? And I've always thought about life as kind of a subset of death. I don't think about it as opposite. I mean, we're all just still kind of molecules, and when you're alive, you're kind of you can violate the laws of physics. You can walk uphill. When you're dead, you can't. I mean, I don't think about it as in such an oppositional way, but still, there's this gift that life provides that is immeasurably beautiful, and how we live that life is, I think, the central question. Um, so when I got involved in the aging field, I remember the first time I went to the Buck Institute, which is up in Novato in Marin County. And Dawn, I know you're not far from there. And on your way there, you actually drive by St. Quentin, and uh, and I was with two of my colleagues, and we're talking about, yeah, there's death row over there, and here we are going to Buck Institute on longevity. I'm thinking, you know, actually, we're all on death row. We're all on death row. We just, we all have a death sentence, and you could say it as we all have a life sentence. And they're in the arena. That's what inmates in St. Quentin called St. Quentin, and they're living the best life they can. We have a lot of freedoms. We have a lot of opportunities, but in the end, we're in the arena, and we're trying to live the best life we can.
Thank you, June. It, the first thing that comes to mind, and it just was let my mind open up to this question just a moment ago. And the first thing that came to mind is I was walking down the hallway in my apartment building a few weeks ago. And my 12-year-old daughter, Violet, says, "Dad, you know how people, how muscles are built, like how people get stronger?" I said, "Tell me." She says, "Well, when you exercise, um, you actually break apart your muscle to some extent. Certain parts of your muscle have to die, and then they are reformed and rebuilt, and that's how muscle is created. Is this constant cycle of it dying and being rebuilt on itself. It's not just this thing that gets larger over time or more strong over time." And she's like, "I thought you'd appreciate that." This amazing thing of a 12-year-old reflecting, like knowing that obviously the work that I do, but being okay with the conversation, the metaphor, realizing that it's a metaphor for life. And it was just a reminder to me of the medicine, the nutrients, the gifts of this work. And that's what's, I would say, less a perspective um, that has changed, and more this, what the gifts that I get continues to change. The perspective that's become more clarified is that death is a medicine. That the work that we do confronting our mortality, the work that we do at a bedside um, of a loved one, the work that we do in grief, the work that we do if we're taking care of the body of a loved one or carrying the body in a processional, um, that 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 there's so much medicine and there's so much nutrient in that. And then when we act by proxy, when we put a prophylactic over the experience or us in between the experience, um, we deny ourselves the necessary nutrient to go on after that death, to be the new person that we need to be, not to become, the normal person, not to be reintegrated, but that it's very much that kind of hero's journey of, like, we need to be present to the whole experience to be able to get the thing that we need to continue along our destiny, if you will, to be able to continue along the thread of our genius. And I think that it's a mythological idea, but it's also just a very practical idea. I I found it very hard to grieve, um, and we talk a lot when we talk about grief about it overwhelming us, about how people aren't able to function, about how it's a wave and they don't know how to stop crying, or they don't know, that is the majority of the language around grief, actively grieving, that I've encountered. And when my father died when I was 13, it was 7 years before I grieved him. And I didn't even tell friends at school the day that he had died, because I didn't think they could hold the weight, um, which says as much about our society as it does about how I was selecting friends at that time. But I was breaking up with somebody, or in a breakup conversation when I was 20, because I'd been caught in a lie. And the vulnerability of that moment, and realizing that there'd been a lot of secrecy and lies in my life around my father's death, and that I was taking part in that, and I had lied to a person, I was hurting them and I was hurting me. I started crying profoundly. And the person who I was in the breakup with was very moved and thought it was about us, them, and the relationship. But in fact, it was the first opportunity, this crack in the door, in the window, for me to start to grieve my father. And I was, you know, uncontrollably crying for a couple hours, and it was such a catharsis. And it's that reminder that I, I'm doing this work for a reason. I need this muscle, this protective mechanism around me, to be constantly broken down by the beauty of humanity. Um, I became a survivor at a very young age because my family wasn't there for me. And I know how to get shit done. Um, but I don't always know how to do it in the most compassionate and tender way. And I am reminded about that all of the time by doing this work. When I sit with people for death dinner or I work with them for EOL, it requires such tenderness and it requires me to break apart my desire to get things right or to focus on the product, but actually to be present with people. It's taught me how to take care of my daughters and be present to them and listen to them, listen to their pain and not be afraid of it. Um, and again, surrender. But it's really just brought into focus that this is a medicine, this work. It has a different version of the medicine to deliver to all of us. And the more that we can reclaim it and the more that we can make it a community act, just like food, because we over industrialized food and we lost the nutrients there. But just like food, there's nutrients in death and dying and grief and facing our mortality. So that's what's really changed in the past 12 months. Say it's what I've seen, and I'll talk about this a little bit more in my prediction, is maybe that there's an opportunity. There's possibly a golden age of mortality consciousness that's available to us. I don't know if we'll claim it, but that's what I've been watching and tracking and hoping for. But we're going to talk a little bit more about aging. When we were having our our brainstorming chat, our ideation chat about like, oh, what should we talk about? Joon brought up aging, and we just kind of take aging as a given, as a part of being alive when it isn't necessarily. It's a function. Joon's like, what's a function not that every organism has, but what is meaningful about aging, and why is it so prevalent in nature, and where is it absent in nature, um, and then also let's throw in a curveball, and this is for everyone, not just Joon. I'm picking on you a little bit, but in these rooms I like to. But is it really meaningful to think that we can cure ourselves of death? Is it really meaningful to think about this idea of moving beyond death, or uploading ourselves to some sort of mainframe? So there's a couple seemingly unrelated, very related big questions.
Okay. Thank you, Don. Yeah. Yeah, yeah, wow. There's an old theory in biology, evolution biology, by August Weismann, the idea that aging, senescence, was a useful trait from a societal perspective because it allowed older members to make room for newer members. It was kind of like ecological succession. Um, we know that enduring power structures, can be a problem. If you have a monopoly on power. In nature, you can get monopolies on power. Senescence just has a way of just redistributing that power and starting over. So the perspective was, this is August Weismann's perspective, that it actually promoted evolution to have senescence built in as the backup, because death is always there, and there might be the slings and arrows that take people out. But just in case slings and arrows didn't take you out, senescence will be the backup plan to take you out. So, and it was an old idea, and I've thought about human aging through that lens. We know that that cells, prokaryotes, it is said, based on genomics data, that programmed cell death genes were a late invention during biology. In other words, bacteria just divide and they're kind of immortal in that way. But at some point, they developed these genes that allowed senescence. So, it presupposes that maybe senescence is an active process, which is a very interesting, provocative idea. When I think about where we are in civilization 2021, we've undergone our diasporas and we've re-met in this collective village, global village, connected to the internet and transportation. And we're like the bacteria, the biofilms, where all the bacteria got together. We formed these superorganisms. We're made up of 1 trillion cells, and all of our cells are highly aligned. They're 100% genetically identical or close to it. And what starts happening at 40, it's really interesting. As a radiologist, you start to see that all of your tissues start hoarding fat. There's like a lane of fat next to every blood vessel. There's like a mound of fat next to the kidney. It's almost like we go from being very pro-social, as all of our cells are pro-social, to more selfish. And as we become more selfish, we store fat, hydrocarbons, which is like going to war for oil. We start taking things out of the system, extracting from the system for ourselves. And then the worst form of that is obviously cancer, where some of these cells, not only are they hoarding, but they figure out the algorithm, the behaviors of the cells next to them, and subvert them to create these feedback loops. So it's almost like, I don't know, any sort of positive feedback loop economy, the economic power structure you see today, which is pretty much every one of them. So in a way, I think about aging as the loss of our prosociality, our cellular prosociality, which means, could you actually figure out what those prosocial algorithms were biologically? For instance, one of the things that makes all of us, all of us more caring and nurturing, besides our intentions, is a hormone called oxytocin. I mean, oxytocin will literally make you nurture others instead of yourself. So I wondered, could oxytocin be used in the treatment of cancer by making the cancer cells be more pro-social towards their neighbor instead of extractive? It's a lunatic notion, but it turned out somebody did that study. Like in vitro, it shrinks tumors. So I would love for scientists out there to be thinking about sociality, the sociality of cells, not just study things at the molecular level and all that, which is all great, but the relationships between the cells. Because one of the things that the pandemic has shown all of us is that we have this innate instinct to nurture others. And when we're facing mortality, it brings that out. So could we actually have more of these things, whatever the algorithms are, at the cellular level, at the social level, um, that make us nurture others. When I think about the blue zone and all those subpopulations that have hyperlongevity, people talk about a lot of things that are common between them, such as diet. When I look at those societies, what I see is they're kin village. They're all nurturing each other. They're checking in each other.
Yeah.
And when they check in each other, they serve each other. So that alone, number one, it makes you feel less lonely, but more importantly, you don't fall through the cracks. I would love for that kind of system to be present in America as well.
So many things I get to see. I can't wait to hear Don your thoughts. I'm gonna one quick thought. What I didn't realize that we were going to create a new diet pill out of this, but it sounds like we might be. Oxytocin, lose that bulge. The other thing, though, that I'm thinking about, as a 45-year-old man, I'm quite aware of the hoarding that my cells are doing, and I'm thinking of the tradition in India, in certain Hindu communities where, and I think it's primarily women that do this. At a certain point, as they're in their as they become elders, all of their possessions, these women give all of their possessions away, and many of them will go on a pilgrimage, a massive pilgrimage across India, and that there is a more of an association with um, the life that's ahead and not with the hoarding. And I think that a lot of people, as there is an elder state too, where people do lose, become smaller and maybe lose that tendency to hoard fat. I'm curious, June, if you just any thoughts on that. Is there a time when we stop hoarding that fat as well?
I'm happy to address that, but I want to hear
Yeah,
Dawn's
yeah. Let's go.
perspective on
Yeah,
the
let's
same
go.
question.
I don't know that I can interject anything beyond what you just said, June. I honestly, the way that your mind works is pretty spectacular. As a woman who has experienced the gift of bursts of oxytocin while giving birth, while nursing my children, the phrase that you used, Michael, of that it will have us care for others before ourselves, right, at the expense of ourselves. I look at the work that the end of life community does for each other. I know we have a number of people who are trained and or looking forward to training as end of life doulas who are joining us right now, as well as people who work in the hospice field, a number of hospice nurses joining us. And I certainly experience this extraordinary gift of service at the end of life and being at the bedside at the end of life. And countless times I have had family members turn to me and say, thank you so much for what you're doing. Thank you. Can't imagine how hard it is. How do you do this? Isn't it depressing? And I think for anyone who finds themselves gravitating to this field, the answer is a unanimous, resounding no, it's not depressing. There is something utterly life-giving and life sustaining, life nurturing. You talk about nutrients so much today, Michael. That this work is anything but draining or hoarding. It keeps me coming back for more. I often say I get more out of this than I could possibly be giving. It's just, I don't know the biologic economics of that balance sheet. And yet that's how it feels over here. And so this notion of recognizing the community magnetism, and whether it is at the subcellular level, right? If we're actually talking about what do our neutrons and electrons and positrons do, and are we just mirroring these magnetic poles, and then to the cellular level, and then to the organism level, and then to the societal level, right? If one of my favorite films created years ago called Koyaanisqatsi has the one word in it, indigenous Native American word Koyaanisqatsi, chanted throughout the entire film. And it's image after image of showing the mirroring, the development of human beings as society, as well as then on the microscopic level. And if we pay close attention, as I think I'm hearing you say, Joon, of what are we naturally doing that actually has us sustain ourselves in harmony, as well, that includes senescence, that includes death, because there's a harmony to that of what it allows, what becomes nurtured to grow and create as a result. I think if we pay more attention to that, sometimes I worry that technology, as magnificent as it can be in connecting us, it runs the risk of losing sight of the inherent harmony of how we are so deeply connected to this planet and all the ways the planet has evolved and will continue to evolve. Talk about the future of death, right? And Mars and beyond, right? I mean, I don't know those biosystems. We're going to learn because we're going to plant ourselves there one way or another. And what does that future look like? But I think as long as we can continue to feel that umbilical cord to our core existence, I think we'll find a way to nurture and sustain ourselves through death, and the legacies that get created as you started this entire program, Michael, who's with us, maybe not in breath, they're still with us, profoundly teaching us, keeping us connected. Those are my thoughts.
Well, the great irony, I don't even like the word irony around it, but this thing that has the potential, and it's part of its DNA, death, is to connect us, is to bring us together like a magnet, and to honor and to grieve and to connect. The irony, the tragedy, is that it so often isolates. We're isolated around it because we don't talk about it. We're isolated around it because of things like coronavirus, and because of our rituals are inherently some isolating in some cases. And then it breeds this type of isolation, which is the opposite of longevity, which is what I'm hearing. And then also some of that good strife, right? Like we want to be shaken up to keep our resilience. I used to start every dinner party by creating a little bit of a crisis because people would be more beautiful. Like they would respond, and the beautiful parts of people come out of them, and in a crisis, and beautiful. Like I get to do this work. I look across every death dinner I've ever done. I say, "You're so beautiful right now," and it's not because you're talking about you're in this encounter, this strife. So um, I know Joon wants to respond to that, and in your response, Joon, this is also the time to paint a picture. Okay, we have this is it's not going to lightning round, but we might extend a little bit beyond 5 because we really want to get these. We have to learn about the past, we have to learn about the personal to project out, but we want to hear a prediction about the future of death from both Joon and Don, and maybe you can address the idea of curing death.
Mm. Yeah, I know. That last one I don't know. We'll leave that to the field's infinite imagination. But I want to build on the things that you guys both said. Just you know, the really life affirming things that emerge from crisis or aging or death. I mean, you're talking about the positivity. What it makes me think of is, Hemingway wrote Death in the Afternoon, which is really a spectacular book. He was in love with bullfighting for what it meant. He really wrote about the metaphysics of bullfighting. Um, and in it, he said the fact that the bulls, everybody watching the arena, kind of like St. Quentin, like watching the arena, knows that the bull's going to die, whether the bull's actually a winner or not, and that eventually fate will catch up to the matador. So that it's really about death, and that the Spaniards had this philosophy about death that came from bullfighting and watching bullfighting, and what they got out of it was the magnificence of the art of bullfighting. Now, I mean, there's a lot of cruelty involved in bullfighting. But the fact that the death is all around them in bullfighting, and yet people perform to this exquisite level. His message in his book was about the fact that, because here it's like an artist is basically facing death, right? I mean, what artist actually puts their life on the line? But the magnificence, the art that emerges from the fact that death is on the table, that death is a possibility, was the larger existential meaning he derived from it that it communicated. So um, my sense of how we will deal better with death in the future is to understand our lives as art pieces that we're all manifesting our art. It could be through palliative care. It could be through hosting dinner series. It could be through any of the work that people are doing. It could be through people working on the science of aging. These are all things we do, in the context of the fact that death is ubiquitous and inevitable. And it brings out the best in humanity. I mean, it brings out some of the atrocious things too. We know that, right? It's a yes and, but I think we have the opportunity to live those kind of lives. When I think about death, in a way, my intuition is I have no idea what the future of my death and anybody's death is going to look like. My instinct tells me it's going to be similar to the time before we were born. Like, in other words, we've already been dead before. So the only thing we haven't experienced before is life, and that's the one we have right now, and that's the thing that we can make magnificent.
I love it. Don?
Yeah, I love how you just concluded that, and I have to invoke a quote that our chaplain shared to open our hospice team meeting this morning, which comes from a Jesuit priest, which is, and I will misquote it, but the essence of, we are not human beings with a spiritual experience. We are spiritual beings with a human experience. I think that's what I hear you say, Joon, and I very much resonate with that. My electrons are resonating with yours right now. And my hope in the near term for the future of death, what I hope this conversation and all the work that we and so many people are doing in this field, and that really I think what COVID is teaching us in a magnified way, as I said earlier, similar to what the HIV pandemic or epidemic did, is to recognize the aftermath, right? That life goes on, and there is an experience, a transformation that happens to the people who live beyond the person who's died, which is grief. And that grief is not a finite, predictable experience, that it is a new woven in addition to this tapestry of our life. And my hope truly is that we start to create a society that can recognize and name grief as part of life, that doesn't need to define it or limit its expression. Right now, I think one of the cruelest things we do as a society is to label an appropriate death that justifies a period of a certain expression of grief, and that once that time frame has expired, your grief must also be complete. And goodness gracious, if you don't have the loss of a prescribed relationship that meets a certain threshold of meaning as far as society is concerned, then we don't even get to talk about that. And there are so many things incorrect about those assessments and those societal constructs that I think is worthy of an entire another conversation. So my hope is, though, in the future of death, that grief gets to have really tremendous breathing room and spaciousness to show up fully.
So beautiful. Such an honor to be with you both. I'm gonna try to wrap my prediction into the next 2 minutes. It's the cup will overflow slightly. My prediction, my vision, my dream has to do with people vibrating at a high level and a high vibrational culture. And I don't mean that even in a woo sort of way. I mean it that mirror neurons exist. There is a thing called this kind of vibrational tonality that happens when people are operating at a certain level, and I'm seeing it operate in the end of life space. I'm seeing the amount of people that have moved toward this candle, to this light, hopefully not like a moth. I was thinking earlier of Joon. You're like a moth to controversy, curing death, Hemingway, bullfighting. It's amazing. you really do take the risks in such a beautiful way. But anyway, I digress. The that what I'm seeing is so many people coming to an area of interest that has such wisdom to give to the individuals and to give to the culture at high, and people that are checking each other. It's not a place where there are gurus. It's like a guru-free space. There's no one can claim higher knowledge. No one can use knowledge as power over other people. People try, but I watch this community pretty well root that out and democratize and flatten things. But I'm also reminded of another time when there was a high vibrational community, and there's times like when the Upanishads and the Vedas were written. And I think that when we do operate at a higher vibration, when we are doing work that is sacred and calls us into a space of honesty and integrity and mutuality, like death does, knowledge and information flows through us. Like, it's wild to see the predictions, the scientific predictions that are in ancient Indian texts. It's as wild as the proof of reincarnation that I just recently saw on a Netflix show. I was just like, okay, they prove reincarnation. So um, amazing. And Surviving Death, the reincarnation episode, everyone should watch. It's some of the most powerful TV I've seen. But nonetheless, I'm excited about the unknown knowledge coming through people as this community continues to clarify, connect, build this kind of mutuality and get the wisdom, and then impart it to other people. We don't have the same wisdom traditions as we used to. They're not as vital and alive. We need other sources. And I see this community as being one of them. And it's an honor to be amongst all of you. Thank you for giving us an hour and 2 minutes of your time on a Thursday night. This is the beginning of the adventure. The Netflix show, Kelly, is called Surviving Death. And Joon and Don, I love you both. Kaylee, I love you for producing this. Maybe let's listen to some David Bowie while we drift off into our night. Stay tuned. There's more coming at you, everyone.